So welcome. A few brief notices. Let me begin by saying that, as you know, this is an informal gathering. Our session is being recorded and it will only be broadcast later. So if you don't wish to be recorded, please do switch off your cameras and microphones. Now, this is our third talk as part of the Advanced Studies seminar on sacred space, which we've entitled Presence, Person, Beauty. This is a series we've been organizing in collaboration with Father Peter Newby of St. Mary's University. And this is our last session before Christmas. But we shall continue in the new year, namely with our seminar on cities with Gabrielle Bryant, who will be talking about the matter of time on the alchemy of history in modern architecture. That will be on the 19th of January, 19th of January. And then again, our series on sacred space, with Father Michael Lang, who is probably with us too, and from the London Oratory, who shall be talking about transcending beauty, a search for criteria of sacred architecture. And that will be on the 25th of January. Today we have with us Professor Simon Goldhill from the University of Cambridge, who will be talking about ritual, epiphany and disruption, which I'm very much looking forward to. As always, the proceedings will be very simple. Eric will be chairing the session. Professor Goldhill will do his keynote presentation for about 30 minutes or so. And this will then be followed by a similar period for questions. So perhaps Father Peter might like to start us off there, but that's only a suggestion. Finally, just a brief note to thank Matthew Barrick and everyone at London Met for their help, also with divulging this series. Joanne Gold, Charlie McIntyre, and Nikolina Georgieva, who have been assisting with these sessions at Eric Parry Architects, as well as our graphics team, in particular Russell Watson and Roma McCook. And I'll now give the floor to Eric for his introduction. Over to you, Eric.
Well, thank you, and a huge welcome to Simon. I actually, the shelf of your publications is growing at a very consistent way, and I follow it, though not in detail. But I just would say that the world of architecture and the world of classical studies, and particularly your deep-rooted interests, all going all that way back to the middle of the 80s, with the early publication on Greek tragedy, and forwards through social conditions that are obviously the underpinning issues that architecture deals with in terms of creating frameworks, means that although apparently when drawn into academic circles there are silos, we share a world at many levels. So I think I'm hugely looking forward to what you have to say tonight, Simon, and thanks once more.
Thanks very much, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to end up in architecture, but I'm going to start where classicists like me always start, with Homer, the earliest Western literature we have. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus has returned to the palace to be faced by the suitors who's pursuing his wife, he is encouraged and supported by the goddess Athene, and she appears to him in the shape of a human, but after she's given him her pep talk, she turns into a bird and flies up to a beam in the hall and sits on it to watch the battle start. And thus he recognizes that she is probably a god and not a human. In Homer, gods make those sort of appearances quite frequently. But it's proved, interestingly, impossible for scholars to produce anything that might be called a grammar of epiphany. That is, there's no model of how an epiphany takes shape, how we see an epiphany. It's not a sign of scholarly obtuseness, but it goes to the heart of what I want to talk about today. In ancient religion, there are many ways for humans to communicate with gods and gods to communicate with humans. And the most obvious is ritual. with its libations and sacrifices and prayer. And ritual is always the same, even if they're deviations. They are deviations from what's a rule book or a grammar. The standard model of a Greek prayer includes an appeal for Epiphany. If ever I've given gifts to you, God, appear now and help me. Appear, come now, be present. Yet what Homer shows us is both ritual, with its fixed pattern of cultic activity, designed, regulated to be fixed, along with social rituals, of course, too, that have a similarly familiar script, how to host a party, say, and also moments of disruptive surprise, everyone different, when a God's presence is felt, displayed, or enters the human narrative world. And that contrast is what fascinates me. The recognition embedded in the contrast, the recognition of a tension between human scripts of ritualized repetition as a demand for presence as familiarity, continuity, and the epiphanic disruption that's profoundly unfamiliar, unscripted, shocking. The Greek phrase that marks such moments is thaumaeidein or thaumaeidesthai, which translates usually as a wonder to behold. Now, there is, as ever in Greek, a stunning potential for both active and passive forms in such an expression. On the one hand, what you see is a wonder, something that's precisely out of the ordinary, a marvel, a human turning into a bird. It's, on the other hand, the very act of seeing is itself wonder, an emotional disturbance, a physical feeling of awe. And it's not by chance that Herodotus, the so-called father of history, promises that his history sets out to record wonder, the amazing deeds of Greeks and Persians at war, for sure, but also his amazement at the world as he travels around the Mediterranean trying to explain Greek culture by placing it on the map of the imaginary of other worlds. Nor is it a surprise, though I find it deeply poignant, that Aristotle, high priest of rational categories and the system of logic, insists that wonder is the beginning of philosophy. Both historiography and philosophy look back to epic poetry in their attempt to hold on to the moment of wonder that drives their projects. And for me, wonder raises the question not just of how we inhabit the world, but how we inhabit time. Is presence to be understood as being in time, or is it to be felt as a suddenness of interruption? Is presence our lasting condition, or is it something always recollected in loss? For modernity above all, but I think most surprisingly, you can't understand this question without turning to God, or at least without recognizing the profoundly theological notion of presence, or parousia, to give it its proper Greek charge. Let me explain why. One of the most consequential inventions of early Christianity is timelessness. The idea that God exists outside time. Greeks didn't have that idea. The eternity of God transcends temporality that humans live in and can imagine. For Augustine, one of the very greatest thinkers about time, the struggle to understand God's temporality was ongoing and especially perturbed by the act of creation, that is, the most momentous of singular moments. As God is outside time, Augustine reasons, he cannot have said, "Let there be light," because to say, "Let there be light," takes time. Syllables have duration. Let, right? And God's language, right, must therefore always already be spoken. Indeed, it can only be heard not as we imagine as a voice from heaven, but in silence, inwardly. Now, I'm not going to try and go into all the theological ramifications of this idea, you may be quite pleased to know, nor am I going to discuss the murderous theological politics that culminated in the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, except to say that the arguments turn precisely on the contemporaneousness of the Son and the Father, a shared timelessness that the very words Son and Father seem to belie if understood in merely human language. What I do want to focus on, however, is how this theological dogma became institutionalized into a way of inhabiting time. Back in Homer, where I started, waiting around is the denial of the very purpose of a hero. As a hero, you're meant to be winning eternal fame by doing deeds of daring do, basically killing your enemies, human or monsters. To sit in your tent and cry is empty time. Nothing's happening, and all delay is the denial of heroic purpose. In Greek, chronos is empty time, and kairos is the killing time, the crisis, the turning point of battle, the time that matters, the moment which makes your heroic fame. The Gospels, first of Christian writing, changed the very nature of waiting. As the Gospel of Mark writes, wait and watch, for you don't know when the time will come. Matthew adds, watch, for you do not know on what day the Lord will come. You must be ready, says Luke, because the Son of Man is coming at a time you're not expecting. We are now, if we are the Christian faithful, required to watch and wait. For Christians, the Gospels demand, anticipating, waiting, expecting is what the faithful do all the time. That is how the time of everyday life is to be inhabited. Well, what are the consequences of this waiting for the timelessness of God's promise? Well, Paul says you should pray all the time. And for the institutions of monasticism and the practices of asceticism, this becomes formalized into the daily pattern of 7 offices, prayers at fixed patterns of the points of the day, interspersed with either work or meditation, depending on what sort of monk you were. What this means is that unlike a hero with his epic poem by Homer, or a hero of history whose deeds were narrated by Herodotus, or a culture hero like Socrates, whose life as a philosopher was immortalized in the dialogues of Plato, a good monk has no story. Nothing happens. All a monk does is turn towards God in a monastery, in a place where you live alone, monos, and where your only relationship is your turning towards God as you wait for the death which will translate you into timelessness. For the perfect monk, there can be no story. The only stories for monks are a conversion story, that is entering the condition, or temptation, the danger of leaving the condition. Neither of them perfect. The orders of monks which are silent do no more than institutionalize or even idealize the story-free life of a monk. There's nothing to say. Parousia, presence, is what you're waiting for. And for some theologians, this includes the very act of purposive, indefinite waiting. Parousia endures. But this doesn't mean that the present has duration, however long you wait. Augustine is obsessed with time. His most famous statement, of course, is that I know what time is until somebody asks me. An everyday concept that becomes baffling as soon as you try and think about it. But he's sure of one thing, at least. Who would deny, he asks, that the present has no duration? Like Aristotle, he was acutely aware that now becomes then as soon as you can conceive it or express it. If you split the duration of now into smaller units, then the now infinitely regresses. For Augustine, it is literally and necessarily impossible to live in the moment. What has no duration cannot be inhabited. Well, William James in the 19th century was a slightly more practical spirit, determined to work out how long a moment actually was for a human. And he wrote, the practically cognized present is no knife edge, he's a bit more comfortable about all these things, but a saddleback with a certain breadth of its own, on which we sit perched, of which we look in 2 directions into time. It was possible to count in seconds, and then in fractions of a second, a human experience of now. A breadth measured, said James, from 1/500th of a second to 12 seconds. That's how long now is, according to James. Now, modernity has indeed longed to rediscover the now. Can we get the first passage up? This is D.H. Lawrence, which is a characteristically overstated, heated principle. It says, give me nothing fixed, set, static. Don't give me the infinite or the eternal. Nothing of infinity, nothing of eternity. Give me the still, white seething, the incandescence and coldness of the incarnate moment, the quick of all change and haste and opposition, the moment, the immediate present, the now. Well, for Lawrence, the now, the capital letter, of course, marks the intensity of his striving for a general point here, is full of potential. It's still and seething, burning and cold. And this is what gives burgeoning life, the quick, to speed, conflict, alteration. And this is in contrast to eternity and infinity, which are unmoving in all senses, without emotion, without transition. The moment that remains and blows up the continuum. Lawrence rejects what is fixed, set, static. Now, the religiosity of this incantatory rhetoric is evident, not just in the incarnate moment, and the use of incarnate rather than embodied is a pointed rejection of the Christian dismay at the fleshliness of life, but also in the very opposition of eternity and infinity to the immediate present, again redrawn to dismiss the standard Christian tenet of focusing on eternal life as the goal. Lawrence establishes not eternity, but the now as a rejoinder to such idealism. Could I have the next quotation, please? He writes, the ideal, what's the ideal? A figment, an abstraction, a static abstraction, abstracted from life. It's a figment of the before or the after, crystallized aspiration, crystallized remembrance, crystallized, set, finished, a thing set apart in the great storehouse of eternity, the storehouse of finished things. The ideal is not something invented for a time before or a time after, rather than the now. Unlike the presentness of the now, the ideal is always lost in the past or the future. Well, so much for Plato, so much for Christianity. For art historians, Lawrence Pian will remind most of all of Walter Pater, a very unlikely bedfellow indeed for D.H. Lawrence. Now, in the infamous final section of the Renaissance, Studies in Art and Poetry, Pater celebrates exquisite intervals of physical life, the moment of joy. He revels in the sensuality of his body's sensations and the flow of thought and feeling. Each of these sensations, he recognizes, is limited by time, a single moment, gone while we try to apprehend it. These vanishing moments are what makes the self a shifting, changing, sensible being. It is with this movement, with the passage and dissolution of impressions, images, sensations, that analysis leaves off. That continual vanishing away, that strange perpetual weaving and unweaving of ourselves. Pater offers a profoundly challenging image to the unstable subject. How then to live? How shall we pass most swiftly from point to point and be present, always at the focus, where the greatest number of vital forces unite in the purest energy? To burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy, is success in life. Well, for the stricter Christians who read this in the 19th century, Pater seemed here to be scandalously proposing an amoral life that privileged sensation over duty, ethics, or even a career. The moment without consequences. Pater cut the paragraph from later editions and thus made it famous. But he still has in the hero of his only novel, Marius the Epicurean, declare the little moment, the little point, I beg your pardon, of the moment alone really is. So, of course, if we could have the next quote, the iconic hero of modernism himself, Nietzsche, chips in. He who cannot sink down on the threshold of the moment and forget all the past, who cannot stand balanced like a goddess of victory without growing dizzy and afraid, will never know what happiness is. Again, timelessness and the ideal promise of everlasting bliss, whereas modernity insists that your happiness can only be in a moment, the epiphany of an instant. Heidegger, mind you, resists this with all his might. He hates the counting of now and now, what he calls Jetztzeit, now time. For modernity, he diagnoses indeed temporality ensnares itself in the present, which in making present says preeminently, now, now. Being, insists Heidegger against his own modernity, is not a matter of living in the now, 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 of successive epiphanic moments. Well, this contrast between the moment and eternity is fully enacted at the level of narrative. Children learn quickly that any story needs the adverb suddenly to make its changes. But for a string of philosophers, Heidegger and Kierkegaard especially, the sudden is a term they discovered in Plato. In Plato's dialogue Parmenides, the sudden is the moment when movement stops and when rest starts, but itself is not in time. The sudden, it seems, is the instant without duration that divides states or processes, the very moment of conversion. The sudden is an idea that Plato needs to stop time becoming a conceptually incoherent series of moments or an unchanging flow without the possibility of change. For Plato, the sudden becomes a necessary and necessarily disruptive, violent element in the philosophical process. Is the flash of insight the culmination or the contradiction of philosophical reasoning? I say flash of insight. Augustine would say eruption of grace. Kierkegaard would say leap of faith. I say flash of insight because that leads me towards the idea of vision, and the way this contrast between timelessness and the now, or eternity and the moment, has become physicalized in art history into the contrast between the stare and the glance. In German, of course, the word for moment is Augenblick, the glance of an eye. How we measure time and how we inhabit time and how we look are intimately connected. You can take the quotes down if you want now. I'm done with quotes for a bit, I think. We can follow this through by continuing to think about narrative and time. It's standard to recognize that ekphrasis, the description of a work of art within another art form, is a way of delaying narrative, so that narrative of action is often opposed to description. What's less well recognized but crucial is that there are two modes of looking built into the profusion of ekphrastic writing. On the one hand, you can have a long contemplative stare, matched by the emotional engagement and extended significance. So most famously, Virgil's Aeneas stands before the gates of Carthage and sees pictures of the war he has left, and lost in interminable thought, he reflects finally with the extraordinary words, hic quoque sunt lacrimae rerum, here too exists tears for the world. To be lost in awe before art is how the viewer is imagined. And Aeneas's words echo through the whole epic with increasing layers of meaning as the poem unfurls. There are many such examples of what it means thus to stand before art in wonder and see its to see its meaning over time. My favorite little example of that is the narrator in Proust in À la recherche de temps perdu, who's invited to dinner to see his host's painting by the artist Elstir. And he's so lost in contemplation that after an age, the starving and annoyed party have to tell someone up to break his gaze and let them have dinner. But on the other hand, there are thousands of epigrams from antiquity, which also found an inheritance in the classical tradition, which imagine looking not as that long contemplative gaze, but as a flash of insight. When I saw Myron's cow, I thought it would moo. No context, no extended meaning over time, no special or embedded narrator, just a smart response to an artwork in as small a framework as possible. No waiting for dinner here. The intellectually sharp and brilliant aperçu, rather than the long reflection. So how then do you look? Do you look in the hope of timelessness or for the flash of a moment? Rilke writes, oh, actually, I'm sorry, could we have the last quotation up? I think I put this one on the handout as well. Rilke writes, look, the trees exist. The houses we dwell in stand there still, only we pass it all by like a rush of air. This is not just the familiar contrast of human ephemerality and art's search for the permanence of things. First, he has to start, look, wir. It's a question of how the passing human is to look at the world, trees or houses. But it's also part of his ongoing reflection on what dwelling means. both how we live in the world, we dwell, and how we live in time, we dwell on, we tarry. When we discuss the lived experience of architecture, and specifically when we discuss the aesthetic claim of architecture to beauty, what we understand by such dwelling is absolutely pertinent. Where do we wish to find beauty? In the moment when we turn a corner and our breath is taken away? Or is it in dwelling, the long stare at a space that places us in the world? One of the contrasts in the Rilke lines I just quoted is between movement and stillness. Houses stand, they stand still. And this is made ontological by Rilke. Trees exist, only we pass by it all. Our passing is both our movement and our death, always too short, a rush like air. When we face architecture, the built environment, is it as we pass it by, moving through, or is it something we dwell in, like a house? For Rilke, it's both. We both dwell in it and pass by. And I think Rilke catches something of the question I want to explore here. When it comes to presence and beauty, is beauty to be found in the presence of dwelling in and dwelling on a long, slow experience of space in time, through time? Or is it to be found in the serendipity of the sudden interruption? Like Rilke, I imagine most of us would want to say both. Both the long stare, the familiarity of dwelling in beauty, the extension of time, being present in a built environment, and the flash of insight, the serendipity of something that takes your breath away, the sudden thauma edestai, wonder to behold. So the question might be, how can both of these aims be brought together? If we focus stridently on the viewer, the phenomenology of viewing, then that's what Pater and Lawrence and Nietzsche do. We'll produce one set of answers as we walk between the extremism of Pater's ecstasy of the moment and a more contemplative engagement with the material world. But what if we turn to the people who are responsible for the built environment? That is, the architects, the planners, the policymakers, and the politicians. Can we build both for the ecstasy of the moment and for dwelling in the world, both for ritual and for epiphany? Richard Sennett, in his most recent work, Building and Dwelling, lauds the serendipity, the flexibility, the change of urban environment, what he calls the power of the encounter, which he sets wisely against the dulling sameness of the smart city. The challenge, as I see it, is to imagine how to plan an urban environment, not just for dwelling, but also for epiphany. Can the need to calibrate between a longing for permanence and the transformative moment of grace, between the regularity of ritual and the serendipity of epiphany, between the longing, long gaze and the explosive glance, become a plan that takes physical shape in the built environment? Can that aesthetic fascination with the moment find physical expression in architecture? My hope is so, and that the truly smart city will have some serendipity, danger, and surprise built into our dwelling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, that hugely thought-provoking, and it. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions around that, and I suppose immediately one wonders about time and architecture in the sense of permanence and in the impermanent and the capacity for architecture to take into account things like festivals, occasions, being dressed in temporary ways that might accommodate some of your questions. However, let me ask for 4 questions, please. Peter, I think José suggested that you might be the first.
But you have to unmute, Peter.
You have to unmute.
Well, thank you very much. I like what you said about ritual, obviously from my own perspective as a priest. I wondered, did Siegfried Gideon, looking back to my architectural youth, think about sort of this constant movement as being as sort of his images of freeways and modern city? Did he sort of just pick on one side of your both epiphany and this sense of dwelling and enduring? Is this am I understanding this properly? Trying to get my head round the matter at the moment.
Yeah.
Space, time, and architecture. Is this sort of one side of a?
Yeah. Obviously, there's obviously a long history of thinking about space, time, and architecture, and in particular, the idea that a city without movement, like a shark without movement, dies. Obviously, you have to have movement in a city. So there's that sense in which how much movement, what sort of movement, is that a movement that encourages the slowing of movement, the dwelling of movement, or not, is one of the major questions for the modern city, which has so often overemphasized speed and rapidity of movement over experience of the urban environment. So you would contrast, as it were, the ludicrous work of city planners in some cities in South America, where a huge eight-lane highway is passed through the middle of a city, which is uncrossable, creating, therefore, the slums on one side and the rich on the other. And there'll be one bridge to cross, which is controlled as the maids go from the slums to the houses. And you find that in order to create urban movement by cars, you crush social movement. And then you've got the contrast to that. You would have something like an Italian city where a square is somewhere where you either pass through or you stop. And you think of the space as something that can be done in both ways. So there's obviously, in the history of the modern city, in the transition from the smaller city to the larger city, in the question of scale, there is, and many architects and planners have written about this, that question between moving and ending. But it seemed to me that in neither of those questions, although they're focused on experience, is the issue of beauty, which you put at stake. And so the question might be that I was trying to ask really is that if we're committed at some level in modernity to an aesthetics of the moment, something that has, as well as anybody, has a deep religious background in its opposition to the eternity of religious promise, and saying, no, it's not about eternity, it's about now, it's about this second. What does that actually mean if you try and physicalize that beauty? Now, everybody has had the experience of turning a corner and going, wow, that's blown my mind, that's so beautiful. But can that ever be planned for? Can that ever be part of planning? Well, I understand what Richard Sennett talks about when he talks about the allowance for encounter, the allowance for change, that the most damaging form of architecture is architecture that doesn't understand it's going to change, which is the damage of the smart city that says, no, we're smart enough now, thank you. We're never going to get any smarter, or your smartness now is right. Or the concrete blocks where nobody can personalize space. The effects of psychology on that can be absolutely damaging. So we can imagine an architecture that might want to talk about its own transformability as a contrast to eternity. But can it ever imagine, when it talks about beauty, including the aesthetics of the surprise, which is so crucial to modern aesthetics, that idea that the moment is there? Well, I'm looking at architects, they'll have to tell me whether that's part of, I'm trying to tease out what it seems to me to be a paradox of the commitment to aesthetics of beauty and modernity and modern architecture, between that idea of permanence and that sense that, can you create the moment of wonder in a place where you're meant to live, which is the opposite, which is dwelling. It's not a moment, it's not an epiphany, it's not grace. It can be very beautiful, but it's never going to be a moment of wonder in the same way, which requires surprise. So
turn the corner is therefore how to turn the corner is fundamental here, is how to turn the corner, something I think modern architecture, generalizing, can't do, while the Baroque city can, or even Victorians are able to sort of take the most bizarre pieces of land and turn the corner, like that incredible set of offices or flats that they buy by the Barbican, or by the Barbican train station, a very thin piece on Charterhouse Square. That's completely mad bit of building, but somehow it gives a surprise. But the aesthetics are basically standardized Victorian building, but it just turns the corner, and it is always a surprise to me when I see it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Dagmar, please. Yeah, beg your pardon.
Sorry. Yes, hello. When you were talking about the different conceptions of time, I was reminded of the work of the Italian painter De Chirico, who famously has painted these cityscapes where time is indeterminate and there's a mixture of fixed moments, kind of a frozen moment, combined with different sorts of time. It seems to conjure up a kind of world of his reverie. He also talks in his writings about revelation and perhaps even epiphany. And the cityscapes are really quite evocative and lovely. But I think there's a difficulty when one imagines how that kind of landscape, really dreamscape, could be converted into a real city. And there have been people such as the architect Aldo Rossi, who tried more or less a direct kind of translation of a De Chirico type architecture. But it's it's the same as a painting, and one can argue about how successful his buildings have been. Maybe a cemetery is more evocative than actually a building in the city. So yes, I wonder what you think about that.
That's very interesting. Firstly, I said perhaps the best example is the cathedral, the Sagrado in Familia Sagrado in Barcelona, where the building melts like in some of those Chirico images too. But I suppose I'm fascinated in two particular ways by your question. The one is to anticipate what I imagine the paper is going to be about in January 19th, in terms of the time in the city, and thinking about how history becomes embedded in the city, and how much of the past you want to make part of the vision of the city in the present. And for many people, Richard Sennett being one of them, and me certainly being another, the idea of walking through a historically layered environment is one of the pleasures of urban space, in a way that I think is harder to do perhaps in countryside, and seeing a city that has grown over time with its mess, and then the formalization mess, then the collapse of its mess. And I suppose those sorts of historical moments seem to me to be a very important part of how one might think about planning. It would be fascinating. I went to talk about cities in Beijing, and I'm sure lots of you have been to Beijing and know exactly how much of the old city has just been flattered in the name of modernity, so that most of the space is without historical memory. And there's a very, very strange, or without deep historical memory. And there's a very strange politics involved in that, of course, about what the past should count. And then the special places that are collected as almost museum sites and put in aspic, and are no longer actually places you live in, but you just visit to show, oh, that's what that past was like, how weird. And so that separation of modernity from the past, which makes it a very strange experience, in comparison to somewhere, I don't know, Paris or Venice, cities that people particularly love, where one of the things they love is that sense of embedded time. And so the idea that you can embed time in a city that gives you a deeper experience turns then into a set of ways in which the second point, which is how do you experience that time? Well, sometimes that can be by just dwelling, just by moving through, walking through the street, meeting people, doing things. Is that frightening? Is it not? Is it a risk? Can we take that risk of living there? And that experience of time in the city is something that some modern city planners try to remove by insisting on the speed of travel through a city, that you must all move at the same pace. So the question might be, can you slow up enough to experience time in a city and actually notice what's happened with these historically loaded places, which are marked not by blue plaques, as it were, but by actual experience and memory. And so for me, it's actually being able to, if you like to follow through what Chirico seems to suggest, is that you can have that multiple experience of your own timing within a city, which can be created by architecture. That is to say that if you make it difficult to move in certain places, to slow up, to make people meet each other, to make people watch, make people talk to each other, that might not be a bad thing. I remember going to a fascinating meeting on the top of the Gherkin in London. I'm sure it has a proper name, but I don't know what the proper name is, which was on the public use of architecture. And of course, no one else could go because it was on the top of the Gherkin except for the architects, and people were invited, which was very slight irony about that. But I was asking architects why, when they built parks, did they always put benches in a line? Which is, why don't, if you want people to talk to each other, why don't you put benches opposite each other? Or at angles, so that people can talk to each other? And people say, well, we don't really, I mean, they don't look symmetrical, or aesthetically unreasonable, or some sort of hopeless response. But it does seem to be quite extraordinary that we've taken it for granted that what we do with benches is make it hard for people to talk to each other unless they sit next to each other and talk like this over their shoulder. What a very odd way of thinking about social intercourse in a public space. And if you think about the way public spaces are actually manipulated and used, there's a huge amount of possibility for thinking about what are they doing to time and to your experience of time. And I think that was sort of part of what I was thinking about. Can you do that in such a way that you can, as Peter might put it, create corners? Not just get around them, but actually create corners to make people walk around them so they can have those experiences. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, we can empathize. Yeah, very much so. There's a hand raised, and I can't see whose it is, but perhaps the question could emerge, please.
It's Peter.
Ah, yes.
Thank
There's a wonderful moment of surprise. Hi.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was very enjoyable. As it happens, I was reading that passage from the Odyssey this afternoon. I haven't read it in 25 years, so it was a good afternoon.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about in different kinds of temporality, but one thing was the issue that Eric momentarily raised, the issue of festival temporality.
Yeah.
And I would distinguish between ritual, ceremony, and drama, perhaps. But if the origins of it are in ritual, there is a kind of original condition that can be repeated. Though, as Dagmar always points out, it's never repeated the same way. It's always reinterpreted.
Sure.
And so it's both. It reconciles history with origins, with myth, perhaps, if you're into myth and ritual, so on and so forth. But if one goes then to skip over what ceremony is a kind of intermediate condition, something like the Greek theater, and before we get into Sine Frons and all of that, which is so important to Hellenistic culture, that bare space, which is full of potential, which, across the Oresteia can move from Mycenae to present-day Greece and across, from Mycenae to Delphi to Athens. That capacity for in the absence, in other words, ritual is probably more smart or intelligent about how we inhabit several temporalities at once than, as you rightly disdain, the smart city, which has nothing but efficient temporality.
Yes, that's very helpful. I'd like to say two things to that. The first one is whether we think modern society has adequately utilized the notion of procession which comes between your ritual and drama, but seems to me crucial for articulating space in the urban environment. So that from my experience, my historical knowledge of the classical city, one of the things, the ways we understand our experience, our understanding of what might be called the imaginary map of the city, is by a series of ritualized processions where you go from point A to point B in the city and you mark out that space. And that becomes a very important way of conceptualizing, formalizing space. It occurred to me that we don't do a great deal of that these days, unless we're going to go to Catholic cities and religious processions. Those do quite a good job. But in the modern city, it occurred to me that football matches, in the good old days before COVID, when we had such things in a proper way, there's ways in which people come out of stations all around the football stadium in London and start to walk towards a centralized point. And they move in and they get bigger and bigger crowds as they get in, and they focalize around this sort of central playing field. And it's a ritual time of a Saturday afternoon or whatever, and it's a special time and it's marked out. And then it becomes and then people diffuse through the city. And that's a way of marking out local territory. And people care passionately about local territory in terms of football in a way that is perhaps baffling to people who don't understand about the local in football. So in one sense, it would be nice to think about the ways in which processions mark out space in that way with regard to temporality. I mean, the rush hour doesn't quite do it for me, but it does obviously have an effect on the urban environment. And it's not quite as ritualized as I'd like and not quite as attractive. But the other side of what you're talking about in the modern city is to think about the informal use of space through drama or whatever. And I think informality is terribly important because it disrupts the claim of regularity and control that so many planners want. And the question about how much informality we can allow, I mean, it is a very, very interesting question for the urban today, because, you know, it goes against planning. And yet, again and again, we see, you know, the very simplest level, children don't want to play in the playgrounds that are built. They want to build their own playing space. And there are plenty of adult equivalents of that. And so it's a very interesting question about whether planning can allow for the serendipity of non-planning.
Mm.
And I think that's a really, really hard question. You know, can you plan to non-plan? One would hope so, but it's really, I don't know whether Eric, whether you've ever done that. Whether you said, all right, we're going to leave. This is a blank space. We're not going to fill this. Anyone can do what they like there. It doesn't sound to me like there are very many architects who could do that. I mean, but maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, I think that the business of transformation and, that something like the medieval mystery play would allow the transformation of fabric, which is very recognizable in one circumstance, in a formal, rather dry way, and then becomes activated and excited within that world is incredibly interesting to speculate on in terms of the way that space, can be adulterated in some way, whether it's permanently or otherwise. I live in a very odd world where there's a Banksy on the corner near the Barbican. That was his own homage, and suddenly that is made permanent by a kind of piece of perspex that goes over this highly valuable. Anyway, so I think that as a planning for the unplannable and is probably as important in the public sphere as it is for those moments of surprise in the dwelling space, whether it's a good meal or a good conversation. So I think it's at least possible to think creatively about those about nurturing those possibilities of change, and not always being caught by the monumental, probably, which one is inclined to do, and it can be a very much a mistake. I know that Peter, you may want to come back there.
Just a quickie.
A couple of other questions lurking.
Yeah, just a quickie. I think there's a vexed topic in architecture called public space, which tends to be outdoors or in a foyer,
Mm.
when in fact, if following the Chicago school, if you distinguish the public and the crowd and think of the public as having a dimension of commitment, political, call it, even social, whereas the crowd is a kind of aggregate of individuals, it's pretty hard to find a private space in a city. Maybe the loo, and that depends on who you take your showers with. But almost everything has I think the public is a much wider spectrum than things like figure field plans tend to suggest. That's all.
I think that's. I was rather like the hope of the Newton Institute in Cambridge, which was designed to be inhabited by a group of dysfunctional people, namely mathematicians. But they knew that mathematicians, while being socially dysfunctional, needed to bump into each other and do maths together. So they created spaces on staircases, whatever, with boards, so that people could do maths halfway up the stairs and things like that. And I thought that was quite sort of clever and interesting use of the serendipitous as a principle.
Early Google campus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I know that Elizabeth Theokritoff is waiting to ask a question. Could I ask for you to pose it, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, I can't put my hand on the plug-in camera at the moment. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Once you got beyond Homer, I was rather out of my depth. So my question it may be rather a silly one and perhaps not very coherent. I was interested.
Silly answers.
Right, you can yes. I was interested. You point out that the monk or nun is someone without a story. I'd never thought. Perhaps you didn't put it that way, but that is something I can recognize. Also, the monastic life is absolutely one of dwelling, and I rather lost track of whether you were making that connection or not making that connection when you talk later about dwelling. There's more than one story of a monk asked, what do you do all day? And he says, well, I live here, I dwell here. And I will be interested to hear from you or perhaps some of the others how far these characteristics of monastic life you find reflected in monastic buildings, monastic architecture. I mean, I'm familiar primarily with Eastern Orthodox monasteries, and I would say that they are very much characterized by that sort of informality that people were talking about just now, that they are places for the community and they are places that start from the place, the topography, the landscape in which those monastics dwell. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, I suppose what I was using the monks for was to try to imagine the way in which a principle about time, this idea of timelessness and hoping for the timelessness or eternity, the eternal bliss, might turn into not just an ideological presupposition or theological presupposition, but become instantiated in a way of life, and then in an architecture, and then in a form of being. And so to think about dwelling in all of those ways, so you dwell on an image, you dwell on a problem, and then you dwell in a place, and then you dwell on, and you keep dwelling. And I wanted that to be the extreme version of what the opposite of epiphany might look like. I mean, it was perhaps cruel to take monasticism as the opposite of epiphany. That some would be upset by that. But it was the idea that actually, that idea that you could have a space with no surprise, a space with no story, a space and a life where waiting was the dominant mode. And if you think how often you think waiting is regarded as a bad thing in the modern city. When you wait for a bus, you're doing nothing. This is bad news. You're waiting. If you're in a traffic jam, you're waiting. You're doing nothing. You're wasting your economic potential as a bourgeois individual. It's not true in a monastery. You're waiting. By waiting, you're waiting for something. right? So it's a continuum. You're waiting for something. And it's understanding that as a form of being and then a form of architecture would be quite interesting. You know, more time should be spent on the bus stop by architects.
You're waiting for something that's not sort of set in the future. I mean, I think that monks and nuns would probably say that there are lots of epiphanies all the time, you know, through the waiting. It isn't just something that you
as I said,
expecting.
What I was comparing it to was that idea of the constant excitement of the now.
Yes.
You know, and thinking that's what one's searching for in modernity, and say, well, no, actually, that these are, and what happens when we try, you know, the question of beauty and presence might be, how do we instantiate in physical form, in materiality, the principles of aesthetics that we're talking about when we talk about beauty? And so I was trying to break apart the notion of looking and beauty into those two sort of rather extreme versions of, you know, the idea of the permanent gaze at one level, dwelling on another level, that sort of long-term eternity, eternal bliss, and then the moment, the excitement, and see, well, what happens if we try and materialize those two? And I can see more easily how you make physical the monastic ideal. I find it harder to see how you materialize the moment of that modernity claims for itself, the moment. And therefore, is there a gap between the aesthetics that we claim when we say beauty and modernity and its possible instantiation in physicality? That was, I suppose, the point of the paper. And you know, so I'm very interested by the thoughts of the informal, or the you know, the way in which humans' use of space can turn that physicality into something that looks more like the moment of now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael Lang, would you, you've got a question? Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Well, thank you. I'm intrigued by the relationship of the planned and the unplannable, and it seems to me, I'm not an architect, so I can't this into the proper words, but it seems to me that the medieval city was quite successful in achieving that. I mean, medieval city with all these, its narrow lanes and its leaning facades and its crooked buildings, and then you suddenly enter into a wonderful square. And now I understand there was quite a bit of planning going into that, and historians have found that even cities that look like having grown just organically experienced quite a bit of planning at several periods in their history. But there still seems to be something there that achieves that surprise and that unplannable moment. Whereas even in early modernity, I sometimes find it's not there. And I went to Heidelberg some years ago, a lovely city, rebuilt after the French destroyed it under Louis XIV. Beautiful buildings, Baroque buildings, but something seemed to be lacking to me, and I think it was basically the lack of medieval fabric. And so, what if that is so? If it's not just my very subjective impression, what makes a medieval city so interesting?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, people seem to always want to go as tourists in particular. I don't know if they want to live there, but they want to go as tourists to old cities. It's one of those things where they say, well, this is the city I imagine. This is the city of my imaginary. And then they go back and they go, well, let's hire housemen to look after us. You know, I'm not quite sure whether that's the best route. I suppose what I'd want to do is to think first of all about whether there is a politics behind that, as well as an aesthetics. And one should remember that one of the reasons why Haussmann was hired to do Paris was to stop those alleyways being something that couldn't be controlled by the military. And it was thought that there. And one of the consequences of that, which is something that I hold on to as a sign of real optimism, is that then, because of the movement of the city that was made possible, suddenly the boulevard became places where people did go and meet, and there was all sorts of weird social mixing, and suddenly it became a place of serendipity again. And that's what I think is fascinating. That was not planned, but it became as it were, the informal center of Paris was the cafe on the street, which suddenly becomes a different version of how you control those big spaces. And it becomes a place where we know encounter was everything. And many people, there was that incredible fascination with the city in that period. So many paintings, so many novels are about the city itself. Not just the people in it, but the city. And so Paris becomes this image of how we form an idea of what is, how do we use space, how do we inhabit space. You might compare that to Vienna, where if you go around the Ringstrasse, at least in my experience, all you feel is imperial power.
Yeah.
You know, it's just that extraordinary sense of scale that is designed to dominate,
Yeah.
which was never reclaimed, even though Vienna has a fantastic culture of cafe. It was never claimed for surprise in quite the same way, at least on the Ringstrasse. And so it's quite hard, you know, I think the how much risk is there in planning is a very interesting question to me, because, you know, I think it's partly a gendered question, in the sense that I think as a man, I'm much happier to put up with risk in the city, the risk of strangeness, because I'm less threatened by it, for obvious reasons. But I also think it's a general psychological issue that's very hard to deal with, about how much risk we want in our world. Because, of course, the trouble with the corner is you don't know what's coming around it. And that's always the problem. So,
Oh, thank you.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of sympathy for what you've just said, Simon. I mean, but one thing about the you know, the ring in Vienna is that it is continuous. The boulevards are not, and they arrive at points. You know,
yep.
They connect parts, so they're very different entities, I think. And anyway, I would ask for any other questions. I don't, Elizabeth, you still have your hand up. Is there a further question you have, or otherwise, I think we've had a wonderful hour, an incredibly thought-provoking 30 minutes. Thank you, Simon. And you know, it would be most interesting to return to this. But any concluding questions? Then I think our session is done. So our thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.